Now, welcome back. I hope you all had a lovely ski. The weather was lovely again. And I hope those of you that enjoyed the ATAC presentation, I heard very good things about it. We now move on to talk about trauma, and unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to me for a little bit. So what we're going to talk about is our experience in London and some of the things that we're doing. And we're going to sort of interactively go through the session. We'll do all the questions at the end, so please sort of hold fire on them. But I hopefully will be able to get a reasonable discussion going at the end. Now, the first thing I wanted to tell you is that I love you. I love you all. And that's why I was here with you yesterday. Now, some of my friends and colleagues that have come across missed me yesterday because I was supposed to be at this. And so you'll recognize there, that's Laura, that's Chrissy, that's Matt, that's Flora, who you'll be hearing from shortly. I don't know who these guys are, and he's not normally that fat, that's just a camera angle. I'm hoping Flora might tell you at the bar later who they've decided will play me. I'm kind of hoping just a little bit of makeup should be fine, could do me, but I don't know. But they've come across, especially from this last night, to come and talk to you today. And the first thing we're going to talk about, so the last couple of years, the team have talked about shock and hemorrhage. And we are going to carry on that theme. Now, Robbie and Sammy sadly can't be here this year because they've got family commitments, and they send their regards and look forward to seeing you again soon. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably all heard about the REBOA trial. Now, I don't know how much depth. Would anyone like to put their hand up if they've actually read the whole trial? So I'd actually say more people than I expected. It's a big trial, and it's pretty significant, and it's pretty significant to our practice. So first of all, I have no declarations to give you, but a huge thanks to Robbie and Sammy for giving me the data to present on their behalf for this stuff. Now, we all know this trial, and interpreting the results, I think, is really, really important. And the key thing here is, if you look here, you've got Robbie and Sam's names there. So this take on the results and what the trial means comes from the authors. It's not a hot take by me. It's not a quick grab or an agendized thing. This is from the people that were involved in the trial and know it. So first of all, what is the trial? Well, what are we talking about? What are we looking at? So it's a well-designed trial. It's a pragmatic trial. So it's looking at the effectiveness and evaluating the effectiveness of a treatment against routine care. It was multi-center, it was well constructed, it was multiple major trauma centers around the UK, and it was sequentially recruited to with randomization. And I think the trial methodology can be seen as being fairly well constructed and robust. The inclusion criteria were someone with either confirmed or suspected life-threatening hemorrhage from the abdomen and caused by an injury, i.e. trauma, and someone that was amenable to REBOA. So again, pretty reasonable setup, pretty reasonable inclusion criteria. So when you look at the trial, I've paraphrased the wording from it, but what you're looking at is a comparison between standard care, which is what we are all doing every day, and because it's a UK-based trial, the care is fairly homogeneous between the major trauma centres you can expect, with some variation, the same sort of care to be delivered whether you are injured in Sheffield, London, Bristol, or wherever. There will be some differences regionally, but you're not expecting massive variations. And it's that standard care or standard care plus REBOA, and that group that we were talking about, uncontrolled or uncontrollable torso hemorrhage from trauma. And the endpoint was looking at 90-day all-cause mortality. Pretty reasonable, pretty sensible setup. So then what happened? So they randomized the first 90 patients, and they were enrolled, and the median severity score was about 41 and 46 for the group, so that was fairly reasonable. But one of the important things, when you look at this here, you see 46 were randomized to REBOA, 44 to standard care. That looks okay. But one of the key things here is only 19 of those patients randomized to REBOA actually got a balloon. And so that's the first sort of thing to think about when we're looking at this trial. So the intention to treat analysis looked at this and looked at the addition of REBOA, and with a good level of statistical evidence, they felt that the 90-day all-cause mortality for this group was higher, and therefore the trial was stopped early. And that's the big headline that everyone's taken away from it. And that's entirely reasonable. And I don't think anyone's going to say that the methodology or those findings from the trial are wrong. It's about interpreting them in a wider context. But the key thing is to look at saying that those patients that got REBOA were only 41% of those randomized to REBOA. So what happened within that group? And what happened between the two groups? So when you look at their pre-hospital data, so the patient's pre-hospital characteristics, a pretty low systolic, that's not a million miles off, 11 versus 9. That's pretty reasonable. You can see why they were randomized that way and enrolled that way. Things start to unravel a little bit when you start looking at what happens to them in hospital. So time from injury to arrival at ED, 90 minutes, 97 minutes. Again, that's fairly reasonable, fairly standard within the UK. And then you look at the blood pressures for these groups. Now, this is where it starts to look a bit different. So the REBOA group, 41%, 18 out of 44 were below 70 versus 21%. And that's quite different, actually. Small numbers, very small numbers, but again, quite different. But the groups aren't that matched. And this is the other thing here. When you look at the abbreviated injury score, in the REBOA group, a reasonable number of those had head injuries and no one in the other group. And that's a confounder, and that's something we'll come on to talk about in some of the other talks. So the key things that I take away from this is that the groups aren't brilliantly matched. Now, that's not a criticism of the people designing the study or doing it. It's because the numbers are small. But it's reasonable on the evidence they've got to stop that study early. So, what happened to the sicker cohort here, looking at the secondary outcomes? So the time from randomization to definitive hemorrhage control, 83 minutes versus 64 minutes. That's still a bit longer, but the sicker cohort seemed to be getting a delay to definitive treatment. Now that could be, and some people within the trial have said that's down to people attempting REBOA and failing REBOA, and that would make sense given that only 19 of those randomized to receive REBOA got it. So it's this skill of putting these REBOA balloons in and putting these arterial accesses into these really sick patients mean that actually it's quite hard to do and takes some time. And that's certainly our experience in London doing this outside of hospital as well. And so the sicker cohort got a bit of a delay and they had a bit of a worse outcome. That seems to, again, make sense and follow. When you look at the differences between the groups, the key difference between the groups. So they're all predominantly male, predominantly blunt trauma, so not the group that we see in London. The REBOA was, in general, put up about 2 hours post-injury. Now, 90 minutes to hospital is not unusual for our group in London when we intervene. But when we look at the time to intervention, 2 hours is probably quite long, probably too long, I would say. The time from arrival to randomization was another 13 minutes. Again, these delays are understandable, but the randomization to the hemorrhage control procedure of REBOA added on time to make it 83 minutes versus 63. And the median time to REBOA was 29 minutes after randomization. That's a long time. The balloon was 29 minutes, which is not a long time, I should say, because the balloons either were deflated too early or there's a training issue about how they were used. And then again, when you look within the data, you find that of the patients that received, and remember only 19% patients received REBOA, 10% of those patients received a zone 1 REBOA and the remainder a zone 3. And 8 of those patients received a partial REBOA. So now the numbers get even tinier, and what you can extrapolate from those becomes even less. But when you look at the trial, the question is still there. Does the combination of REBOA and standard care, is it better than standard care alone for 90-day all-cause mortality? I think we can say from the data, it's quite obvious that it's not. When you look at a cohort that was a little bit more hypertensive on arrival and had a higher proportion of head injuries and a delay in intervention. I think once you put all of those things together, it certainly does start to explain why that group did worse. So if you want a more in-depth look at all of this data and the interpretations of it, there's this paper I would suggest you go to by Robbie and Max from the London and Ross Davenport from the London, looking at the promise of REBOA and specifically this trial. So I think we can all agree that when we talk about REBOA, doing it to a patient an hour to 2 hours post-injury in a centre that only sees a handful of patients doing this, in practitioners that don't do this all the time, probably isn't the right thing to do. So I think that's what we can take away from the trial. But what about for us at London HEMS? So even the highest volume centres in the UK only enrolled 4 patients per year into this trial. We would see those 4 patients in a matter of months in London in a much smaller group. So if you think about the last time you heard of something big happening in your department, if it was a retrograde intubation or an awake thoracotomy or whatever, a thing you want to dream up that everyone's talking about in the hospital, oh my God, this happened. Tom Cruise came to, oh, that happens all the time. But if you think about that, think about how many people are in your team, how many people are in your hospital. How likely is it that you as a practitioner will be there for that one case? And how often will that case come around? And therefore, when we're talking about a tricky skill for those of us that aren't interventional radiologists, those of us that aren't vascular surgeons, to suddenly upskill and do quickly in the sickest patients, it's actually asking quite a bit of people. Now, I've done a number of REBOAs, and I find it really hard to get the arterial line in. That's the hardest thing, because these vessels are tiny when people are bleeding to death. It's easy peasy if I'm doing it in theatre for someone who's euvolemic, but it's really hard in this group. So for us, I think if we are getting to those patients early enough, and if we are selecting those patients early enough, then I think it's still a feasible treatment for that small group of patients. But what I think the REBOA trial shows us is when we look at these global treatments and these things, it's not just the treatment. It's not that silver bullet that people have spoken about that's going to solve everything. It's about incorporating it into the patient's pathway at the right time for them, with the right training for us, and doing it the right way. And it all comes down to patient selection. And I think that's a really hard thing when we're talking about finding that elusive, marmot in West Hampstead. There aren't many there. They're far more on the mountain here. You aren't going to find them very often. So you've really got to look hard, and you've got to be certain that you're doing it. And I think what one of the previous speakers said about having honourable intentions when you're doing a procedure, you've got to ask yourself, is this that right patient that I'm doing in? And I think that's a complicated thing. So we can talk more about REBOA at the end or at the bar. The theme of shock is going to go on, but we're not just going to talk about hemorrhagic shock, because I'm sure you'll just get bored. Everyone in London bleeds to death. Well, some of them do, some of them don't. And this is where we're going to carry on to the next speaker.